let's bring in Professor Aristyo Darmawan at the Faculty of Law, Universitas Indonesia, and a current PhD scholar at the School of Regulation and Global Governance at the Australian National University. Thanks for joining us this evening.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, let's start the Global Affairs Insider. In the Philippines, Exercise Balikatan is the most prominent annual military exercise between the Philippines and the United States. And right now, there are other countries who wish to join the Balikatan, like for instance, Australia and France have considered interest. Now, what are your thoughts on the current aggression of China in the South China Sea?
Right. Okay. I suppose I'm going to be addressing just a little bit of the relationship about the military exercise, multilateral military exercise in the regions, and what happened in the South China Sea now. I think first, of course, I think I will always really appreciate multilateral exercises in the regions, whether the Balikatan exercise, which is hosted by the Philippines and all with other countries such as the U.S. and Australia, but also Indonesia is also have its a bit of similar multilateral exercises, what we call it the Garuda Shield exercise, which involved countries such as the U.S. and other countries as well. I think those kind of multilateral exercises shows a lot of importance. It's first, of course, it shows it shows a message as well to all countries that all these we have a lot of cooperations and so on and so forth. But most importantly, I think a military exercise can robust the capacities for militaries in the regions to have more capacities and capabilities in the regions. And in relation to what happened in the South China Sea, of course, I think in the past few years, the regions in the world have seen a lot of intrusions between the Chinese Coast Guard with the Philippines authorities. I think it's of course a thing that it should be avoided, and I think the thing that we don't really want to see. But of course, what happened in the past few months, I think China remains pursue assertive measures in the disputed area, and of course I thought that it's going to be an unproductive for the regions, for the ongoing South China Sea Code of Conduct negotiations. Of course, all ASEAN claimant states as well as China in many diplomatic occasions has reiterated the importance of dialogue and the importance of avoiding conflicts in the regions and committing to have the South China Sea Code of Conduct. But I think the assertive measures that China have taken in the past few months, I thought it's going to be unproductive for the ongoing Code of Conduct negotiations, and I think it's reducing trust between all parties to be able to settle the dispute peacefully and to maintain the dispute peacefully. So I think it's something that is very unproductive. But in regards to the multilateral exercises, as Balikatan, as you mentioned, I think it's good to have signals that we have, we have allies, and we have the capacities of our militaries to deter and respond to any assertions and violations of international law in the South China Sea.
So, Miss Professor Darmawan, I just wanted to clarify that you have mentioned earlier that it's unproductive for the code of conduct for the ASEAN region as a whole. Do you think that this policy of the Philippines internally is somewhat provocative or acceptable considering of the current situation that's happening on the Philippine experience against China or with China in relations to our so-called West Philippine Sea? I just wanted some clarification on that.
No, I think what the Philippines did is very much more responsive to what China did. Of course, I think the Philippines as a country have the right to defend itself and very much in part of law enforcement. So I thought that what Philippines did, I think it's very much important to show that our regions, all the claimant states, will not keep silence when there are violations or assertive measures by Chinese law enforcement institutions. So I think those kind of response, I think it's important to show a not acquiescence of what China claimed in the disputed area.
Yeah. Another issue that I would like to ask from your perspective, recently our Philippine president had a trilateral meeting with the Japanese Prime Minister and US President in Washington. And during that time, there were an increased number of Chinese militia ships that were observed in the South China Sea and the West Philippine Sea towards the culminating advent of the Balikatan exercises that we have right now currently. So, what do you think about this China militia ships? Do you think they are provocative or a reaction to all these things that are happening politically in the international politics among the neighboring nations, with the United States, for instance?
Right. I think you mentioned about the maritime militia itself. I think it's very much an issue has been going on in international law and international law debates because, of course, I think when we talk about the Chinese maritime militia, I think it seems to me that China has been playing in a gray zone area of international law. Where, for example, when we talk about the military warships and so on and so forth, so there's a different legal regimes that govern the actions of warship in time of war, and the act of law enforcement, for example, is done by Coast Guard. And the China maritime militia was for the there has been a lot of debates going on whether and how this might fit with the regime of international law, because in itself it can't really be considered as a warships as based on the criteria under the United Nations conventions on the law of the sea, but it's also not full of civilian ships, right? So I think China, by using the maritime militia, has been trying to play in a gray zone really in international law. So they're and trying to playing a gap that exists in international law. So I would say that what China did with the maritime militia is not only trying to avoid the international regimes and playing the gray zone area in international law, but also trying to provoke and in a lot of circumstances has done quite an assertive measure as well in threatening its neighboring claimants in the South China Sea, including to some extent the Indonesian fishermen, and of course a lot of fishermen in the Philippines as well. So I think it's China, what China did with the maritime militia it's trying to play within the gray zone of international law, as well as an assertive and trying to bully some of the others claimants in the South China Seas.
Yeah, this gray zone tactic of China is quite confusing. But where do we draw the line between the international law and then the gray zone area in reference to the threat to one's national security? Because what's happening right now, it's totally not acceptable within the standard of international law, or threat to one's sovereignty. But in so many realities, they are provocative, or they are even a threat already to the national interest of our people. For instance, in the case of the Philippines, when it comes to the exclusive economic zone.
Right. Yeah, I think that is a very good point. And of course, I think there has been a lot of debates, even in international academic discourse, on what is the gaps or the limits of conflicts, and when it's going to be a law of war and when it's going to be a time of peace under UNCLOS, right? But I think what I thought quite clear is that the law of war or the law of naval warfare is going to be started when there's a war is started for example, when a country has declared there was in an armed conflict with other countries. So the law of naval warfare, I should say, the San Remo Protocol is going to be used. But other than that, I should say it still be part of the law enforcement measure under the United Nations Conventions on the Law of the Sea. And that is the tricky part indeed. I remember I encountered colleagues who have had quite a fierce debates on whether or not China's can be considered still as law enforcement measures, or it's going to be considered as more as a provocative of a use of force. So I think international laws indeed provide. There are several rulings under international tribunals, for example, in the Guyana, Suriname, where a threatening can be considered a use of force. It's certainly prohibited under the United Nations Conventions on the Law of the Sea. So therefore, I think the limits, it's still a gray zone area when the law of naval warfare is started, and when the capacity of law enforcement. I think the China tactic as well is by using Coast Guard more for law enforcement, right? So it's not a navy, which arguably is Coast Guard is a part of law enforcement. However, if we consider the capacities of the Chinese Coast Guard, was very much beyond the law enforcement capacities, right? If we compare with the Indonesian Coast Guard, for example, or the Philippines Coast Guard, the Chinese Coast Guard has much more capacities. So I think that is also an issue as well.
Professor Aristyo Darmawan at the Faculty of Law, Universitas Indonesia, and a current PhD scholar at the School of Regulation and Global Governance at the Australian National University. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
This is Dr. Reyron del Rosario. That's the Global Affairs Insider. Follow us to our next episode only here in IPDCI News Channel.